thanks to everybody for joining us. This is a discussion about Alaska education policy, and funding. I'm going to first start out by introducing our panelists. We have Derek Reed, who is a teacher in the Anchorage School District. We have Andy Holleman, who is a school board member and also a candidate for Alaska State Senate District M. That's Mike, for those of you who speak phonetically. And we also have Representative Harriet Drummond as well, who will be sharing the legislator's perspective on this discussion. Now, before I kind of make some introductory remarks, I would like to acknowledge that we are, at least the panelists and some of us on the Zoom, are we're having this event on Dena'ina lands. In the traditional lands, the nearest Dena'ina village is the native village of the Klutna. And I want to acknowledge that the people who have lived here since time immemorial, and that it is a privilege that we share this land with them. All right, so why education? Well, I have said many times before, education really is the foundation for a prosperous society. Educators shape our lives, not only in what they teach us, but sometimes in the directions they push us. I moved around a lot as a kid. By the time I was a freshman in high school, I had attended 11 different schools, and that was in 5 states and 1 U.S. territory. So I was exposed to a lot of different learning environments. Now, growing up younger, I was really getting into geology and mineralogy because I was living in the Black Hills in South Dakota. And I was really getting good into math. But then I had this really bad chemistry experience and algebra 2 experience in high school, and that kind of shifted me in a different direction. But when I was in college studying political science, I was taking this one particular class where the professor, after getting to know me and my style after a while, said, you're really good at research and debating. You should think about law school. Well, that is a direction I did take. So we want to talk about what we need to do to shape lives and educate the future workforce of Alaska. And I say workforce of Alaska because we really want to create an environment where students will want to stay here and will be able to stay here. And I also want to talk about kind of what funding is needed to do the things that we're not doing or not doing well enough. Now, I don't want to talk specifically about how are we going to get the revenue for that funding, because that's actually a different panel farther down in our candidate discussion series. I also want to just make a quick note for everybody watching that we don't want to get into the nitty gritty of specifically Anchorage School District policies. This is more of a bigger discussion on state budget. So where are we at right now on state education? So obviously the budget is a big issue that's impacting education. It's been cut 50% in the last 8 years, and we've been kind of stagnant at about 4.5 annual funding as a budget. But as a result, we've had what was originally a proposed $130 million cut to the University of Alaska system. That was compromised to $70 million. They're going to see significant cuts in our university system over the next 3 years. We've lost dozens of programs. We're losing classic Alaskan sports like skiing and hockey. And it looks like COVID-19 is also causing some additional significant losses of revenue for the university system. For school, $30 million vetoed from the budget for K through 12 in the 2019 budget. They're losing also additional funding through K through 12 due to loss of enrollment of students because of COVID-19. And there are a lot of different policy issues that people talk about that are of concern. How do we really effectively teach students so that they learn things that are important rather than teaching to the test? How do we have safe schools? How do we retain teachers in our rural communities? What do we do about our student-teacher ratio? While statewide it might look good, in Anchorage, those numbers are not particularly favorable. And what do we do with things like adjusting the base student allocation? So with that, I would like to introduce and invite each of our panelists to kind of give their opening remarks and give their thoughts about what are some key issues. Maybe let's celebrate some highlights. What are we doing well? What do we need to improve on? And what do we have to do to make those improvements? So we'll start first with Derek. Derek Reed, take it away.
All right. So and that was, what are we doing well and improvements? What was the third one again, Carl, just to grab it?
How can we make those improvements?
Sure. Well, I want to say that before I get started, I want to recognize who's also on the Zoom with us. We have the wonderful Barb Clark, who is also a teacher at the Anchorage School District. And I got to say, I got the chance to work with Barb over the summer in a little bit, just designing curriculum for ASD for the, the distance learning online curriculum. And I've gotten to know Barb in several ways, just off and on. We live in the same district. So I wanted to recognize her. And she's been, how long have you been teaching, Barb?
Just wrapped up my 20th year a couple of months ago.
20 years. So, Alaska, some things we have done well is retain great teachers like Barb Clark. We have been able to have a host of teachers who have been in Alaska for years and impacted many students across the state, across Anchorage. But as time went on, our legislators decided different priorities for how they wanted to treat teachers and how they wanted to treat educators. And that leads way into an area of improvement that we can do for our teachers. So Barb and I are on different retirement systems, vastly different retirement systems. And where Barb in her retirement plan, what the state has done to her, or for her, I should say, in terms of her service, is very different than what the state is doing for newer, younger teachers that are new to the profession and young to the profession. I'm in now my 7th year of teaching, and it's a vastly different retirement system than what teachers before had, and that in itself has been a big dissuader for for teachers and retaining and getting new teachers. So that's looking at what have we done well before in the past, taking care of teachers on retirement, but we're not doing that right now. So that's one of those areas of improvement. Another fantastic thing we've done in education over the last 10 years, 20 years, is I've seen a huge strides in inclusion and diversity amongst schools and recognition of the diverse landscape that is Alaska. From my school, I see every race, creed, religion, ethnicity really represented at the most diverse school in the U.S. And Barb's at West, and I know she sees an incredibly diverse population, and it's so beautiful to see, everyone kind of merge as one in many ways, and they embrace their differences, and their differences actually make it into the classroom discussion often. So we have done incredibly well with that. And some of that has come from state policy with inclusion of Indigenous people. That's been a really big push on that level. So that's a little about me. I am a teacher for 7 years now, or this is my 7th year, and I've been with the Anchorage School District my entire teaching career, and I love it. And then the last thing I think I want to highlight and then pass on to one of our other panelists is that, Carl, I want you elected because after having several discussions with you, you really understood that the student funding formula, it needs some work. Did it serve a good time and purpose and place right then? Absolutely, I'm sure in many ways, but it definitely needs some work now. And we're seeing that right now with COVID-19 and the loss of potential about $24 million in the Anchorage School District, just because we didn't have as high numbers before. And you've also understood classroom size so well that here in Anchorage, 35 students to a classroom is kind of often seen as the norm in many ways. And what's happened as we've cut 50% of education budget over the last few years, teachers have been given more and more and more and more, but little to no extra support from a state level to do those more and more. So those would be my opening remarks.
Thank you, Derek. Appreciate that. We'll definitely want to talk, I think, about some of your lessons learned from creating an online lesson plan and what maybe we can learn from COVID about how we can make improvements to education and access to education. But we'll switch now to, actually, I think we'll shift gears a little bit and jump over to Harriet Drummond, Representative Harriet Drummond, who has had a lot of experience in shaping our education policy in Alaska, and invite her to give her opening remarks. What are we doing well? What are we not doing so well? And what can we and should we be doing to fix the areas that need improvement?
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for having me, Carl, on this event. It's good to see all of you that I know and a couple of people that I don't know. I got my start by running for school board in the early 90s when I had already done a bunch of work on school facilities, because my kid was in the 3rd grade or maybe the 4th grade at North Star Elementary School, which was built for 350 kids, and there were 550 kids going to school there with 11 relocatable classrooms. And this is a Title I school. My poor kid didn't know who he could make friends with, because he didn't know who was going to be in his classroom from one week to the next. The turnover was so high, and throughout the school year. So I learned a lot about transitional communities and all of that stuff. But we did raise the funds from Governor Wally Hickel to expand that school and work on passing a really big bond issue in 1994, the year I got elected to the school board, $175 million that built 2 new middle schools and 4 elementary schools and dozens of renovations and expansions around the district. I didn't know the first thing about education policy. I knew about facilities, and I knew about the roof over my kid's head when he went to school. But I learned in a hurry, and I spent 9 years on the Anchorage School Board working on curriculum. Budget in particular was an amazing learning experience, and we had a wonderful budget director in Janet Stokesbury, who I think was with the Anchorage School District for about 30 years. The legislature used to call on Janet when they had a budget issue, a money issue that they didn't understand. She was the most knowledgeable person in the state on school funding. And so I learned a lot. But the other thing I learned was that school education is a statewide issue. I met hundreds of school board members from around the state. We have 54 different school districts, and Anchorage is, of course, is the largest one. It contains about 40% of the state's kids. But I learned to approach education from a statewide perspective early on. I was not in it just for Anchorage's kids, because we're a dependent district, and we look to the state and the city to help us fund education. It's important to know how all of that works from the statewide perspective, and learning about the foundation formula and all of what went into that. I don't think it even existed until the late 90s, and I was on the school board until 2003, so got to experience a lot of that. And then I spent several years as a neighborhood activist, and then got elected to the Anchorage Assembly, which also has an impact on the Anchorage School District budget. And then moved on to the House in 2012. And I hate to say it, but there are a lot of people in the legislature who don't look beyond the boundaries of their own district in terms of what they're there for. And I have to credit my school board lessons on taking the statewide perspective and understanding how our decisions affect schools all around the state. And as co-chair of the House Education Committee, we have a responsibility for about 130,000 kids statewide in over 500 different schools. And as I said before, in 54 different school districts. And I'm actually, I think we have been doing pretty well at keeping the cuts out of the classroom until the last couple of years. Districts have been cutting and cutting. They've been cutting administration and all kinds of services. And finally, it's really past the fat and now into the bone and the muscle. And all the teachers online know what I'm talking about. The Anchorage School District consolidated its administrative offices from about 8 or 9 different locations around the city several years ago to that one converted mall in East Anchorage. That building used to be filled with administrative folks. It is now virtually empty. So to say that the Anchorage School District is administratively top heavy is not the case at all anymore. And I know teachers are struggling because they don't have good support from the head shed because those people are mostly gone. And that's not fair. And now who could have been prepared for COVID? I have great concerns about this governor seeking to slash budgets like he proposed last year. That's a terrifying perspective. On the other hand, not too many kids have actually left the state so far. The kids are moving around. They are enrolling in correspondence courses that are run by other districts around the state. So Anchorage's kids, only about 350 have left to go to private school, and about another, I don't know, I think I heard Margot Bellamy say 300 or 400 have left the state. Andy, you might know better than I do. But the others are still in state and they're still in our public schools. They're just in a different school district, even though they haven't moved from Anchorage. So it's going to be really interesting to see how the funding is allocated after the October count. I'm hoping that we will have a hold harmless for school districts because of the totally unusual impacts of COVID-19. But again, we can't really do anything about that until we convene in January. Legislators are kind of funny that way, right? We have to be together in Juneau and hitting that yes or that yay or nay button in order to get anything accomplished, as well as working with the committee process to get things ready to move through the legislature. I'm not sure what's going to happen in October because we've already approved this budget. We approved the budget in May that began to fund schools in July. There was a significant amount of funding that went to schools from the CARES Act, from the federal funding. Yes, the governor did cut the $30 million that we had added to schools that was outside of the formula, but he managed to replace it with about $40 million in CARES Act funding, which really means we didn't get much more than about $10 million more in CARES Act funding than funding that we should have had in the first place. There was also another 40 million or so in CARES Act funding for child nutrition, which was allocated to the schools because the schools know where the kids are that need to be fed. We haven't had a report yet on how those monies have been distributed. And hopefully it will help schools through this whole process. But I can't imagine being a teacher to have to play truant officer, particularly for kids that have not that are not connecting with their teacher and their classmates through whatever system they have chosen to go to school, and it's got to be difficult. My friend Cheryl Childers, who's a retired Anchorage School District teacher, is now in the teacher mentoring program. She's mentoring, I think she said, about 7 or 8 teachers around the state. And one of them is a brand new teacher at Fairview Elementary School. She's got a class of 27 kindergarten and first graders. that she's trying to teach online. I cannot imagine what that's like. I'm really glad the school district is going to be sending elementary school kids back to school in person first, because I think those are the kids that are losing the most by not having personal contact. It's tough. It's really tough. But anyway, doing well, keeping cuts out of the classroom. We're not there anymore. Career technology is increasingly being offered in the schools. I know the Anchorage School District has changed the way it does career technology significantly, and other schools around the state are emphasizing career technology, as well as setting up boarding school programs for intensives for career tech, including in Anchorage. I think it's the Lower Kuskokwim School District bought the Longhouse Hotel on Wisconsin Street. And they bring kids in from their Western Alaska district for 6 weeks at a time. They house them there. There's a fence around it. There's security. They have curfew. They do online learning in the morning, and in the afternoon, they are bused to King Career Center to take advantage of the terrific facility that Anchorage built a number of years ago that small rural districts cannot possibly afford to provide in their usually multiple small community school districts with small numbers of students. We need to increase the BSA. It's going to be a huge fight this year because of our budget situation. But I know that our coalition is committed to maintaining school funding and increasing it where we can. We're hoping that the feds are going to come through with more support, because we're sure going to need it. And we also need to, as you heard me say, we need to improve teacher recruitment and retention, as well as provide universal pre-K so that kids are ready to learn when they hit kindergarten. We don't have nearly enough preschool, and the governor cut $4.5 million additional preschool dollars that we had allocated in the last budget because he said the Alaska Reads Act didn't pass. Well, we know that we need preschool in order for kids to learn to read. It doesn't necessarily have to have a bill going along with it. We just need to be supporting the kids that need support. I think that's enough for now.
Well, thank you, Harriet. Appreciate that. Yeah, there's definitely going to be some discussions on funding, because I think it's very clear that there are a lot of areas that are things we can't skimp on that really need to be funded. And I'm going to switch on now to Andy Holleman for his opening remarks. Tell us a little bit about your background in education and what brings you to the table, and then, like everybody else, your thoughts. What are we doing well? What needs improvement? And what can we do to make those improvements?
Sure. Yeah, I did want to touch back on that initial question about what we're doing well, because there are some things that we need to protect. But basically, I moved to Anchorage a little over 30 years ago, background in mechanics, medium-sized equipment, and used UAA as a way to get a teaching degree. I did 20 years with the Anchorage School District. 4 of those were as the AEA president, representing the interest of teachers. So in a couple of different ways, I've touched a lot more of the district than if I had been in the classroom the whole time. And being AEA president is a little bit of an education all in itself. 2 of the things that we are doing well, that I think we do well enough that we take for granted, in the state of Alaska, we have what I would call equitable funding, in that it's largely the state, and there is a formula that does a distribution and tries to account for the difference in cost. The result is that all of our districts are either they're adequately or inadequately funded to the same level as each other. I grew up in a state where the districts in the cities were pretty lavishly funded, and the districts in rural counties were very sparsely funded. So there are a lot of challenges in the rural areas of Alaska, but they get quite a bit of funds to work with that on. And it's a fairness thing to our kids that I think matters a great deal. The other thing is that within the city of Anchorage, we have our district is fairly mixed, and it follows the housing patterns. You obviously have some concentrations, like South Anchorage tends to be more Caucasian, Eagle River tends to be more Caucasian. Within Anchorage proper, because our housing districts are mixed up, when you walk through the halls of our schools, you see all kinds of different kids in there together. And the cool part is that a kid may walk out of a house trailer and into West High is a great example, and be seated right next to the mayor's kids or any other of a number of people that live in the $1 million homes that are just a couple of blocks further away from West than some of the trailers. Most cities don't have schools like that, where all these different kids of different backgrounds and different socioeconomic levels really do mingle together, have access to the same teachers, the same courses, and the same opportunities. If the governor gets a chance to impose vouchers, which he has tried to do in the past, Betsy DeVos is trying to do it as part of the economic support from COVID, we will become a more segregated school system. And there's just no reason to let that happen. But we do need to be aware of the fact that those things are trying to happen, and we need to keep them from happening in Anchorage. So the fact that our schools have been built somewhat strategically, unfortunately, Anchorage just hasn't shaken out that much to where it's a segregated town where it's got different zones for different people. It is, I think, some of the underlying fact that we're not having the kind of strife that some of the other cities around the country are having, because our kids know each other. They are going to school with all kinds of different kids and forming those relationships. So I just want to make sure that we don't inadvertently let that slip away from us when it happens. Otherwise, a lot of what Harriet had to say, I support. Ideally, we need to get a budget that's structured to something we can sustain year after year and adjust for inflation. There's a huge amount of energy spent within the district every year trying to get a budget ready for a moving target, which is, are they going to pass this extra $30 million? Are they not going to pass it? Are we going to wind up with a $30 million cut? Teachers are watching, wondering if the people that just got hired are going to wind up getting laid off, or if they're going to get shuffled around to different schools because staffing is going to be cut, and we have to load balance that way. It's disruptive and it's expensive. The legislature just doing their job right early in the session saves a lot of money, and it allows a lot of energy to be put back into to educating rather than trying to manipulate things to meet a legislature that's not really doing its job. And lastly, real quick, as Derek pointed out, there is a fundamental inequity in the retirement system. And there are some legislators that are just, I want to say, theologically opposed to a defined benefit retirement, even though there are systems that could be put in place that would save the state money. We can do a defined benefit that, say, has $100 worth of benefit to Derek that really only costs the state $90 or $95 to fund. And those are the kinds of savings that we should be looking for, so that we can pick who we have stay in Alaska, rather than have to go out and just find people that meet the qualifications for hire and hire them in order to staff up our classrooms. There are worse things about it, which is that we have a growing number of people that will reach the end of their working life. They're not there yet because this all started in 2007. But we will have people that work for 30 years in the state of Alaska that retire with a large 401k style retirement. And to a certain percentage of them, something bad will happen. They'll have a kid that gets sick, or they will have some kind of debilitating issue that drains their money away. Not immediately, but say 10 or 15 years into their retirement. So they'll be at a point where they have very little earning potential, possibly no earning potential, and they will have no income at all. They won't have Social Security because that's wrecked by the conditions of our retirement system, They won't have a defined benefit coming from the state. They literally will have no income and will become wards of the state. That's a huge balloon that's getting bigger every year that we need to deflate now over a period of time before it gets critical. The other part is that most people that do the math know that they're in better shape if they take their money and leave the state and go somewhere with a defined benefit. That means their talent leaves and that money that they put away leaves the state. And we're far better off if we keep it here within our state boundaries, have people spend their money in the state of Alaska and make their homes and retirement homes here. So real quickly, I just wanted to touch on those and I'll wait for other questions.
Thank you, Andy. And I think it's really great that you bring up the point of the diversity of our student population. It's one of the things that, as a tour operator, when I'm taking visitors around Anchorage and telling them, I give them a little background about the history of Anchorage and the people who live here. And that's one of the things I always highlight. You look at any annual list of top 20 most diverse elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools. Anchorage schools are always on those lists and usually in the top 5 or top 10. So we really do have an incredible, that's another part of the value of learning in Alaska is we do have a lot of people from different backgrounds who live here. I know for me growing up, even though I went to 11 different schools by the time I started high school, I think part of the value for me was I was exposed to a lot of people from different backgrounds. And that's one of those intangibles in education that we can't undervalue. So thank you for bringing that up. I think now what I'm going to do is I'm going to shift to the Q&A part. We do have some questions that were submitted by folks when they register. We encourage them to ask questions as part of the registration process. So I think to benefit people who may not know the distinction, happy any of the panelists to kind of educate us on the distinction between charter schools and the public school system, and if there is any hybridization that also works in there. Full disclosure, I attended public schools up until I was in high school, and at no choice of my own, attended a private school, and but then public schools after that, public universities. So I've had a little bit of both, but I'd like to hear from the educators, kind of your thoughts on the roles of those systems in education and kind of what their differences are.
I'm happy to speak to that as well. When you do say charter schools in the state of Alaska, you're talking about a situation that is different from any of the other 49 states. And so when you're out of state and discussing charter schools with anybody, they don't believe that you know what you're talking about because it doesn't match up. Our charters are owned by the Anchorage School District. They're staffed by Anchorage School District teachers under the same contract as folks in the neighborhood schools. The big thing is that they have a charter with the district that allows them a certain amount of autonomy in choosing their curriculum and in how they manage their budget. And to be honest, I think it's a model for what we should be moving our neighborhood schools to. And that's not an effort that the Anchorage School District or anybody else is doing right now, from anything I can tell. We have a very concentrated central power at the Boniface Education Center, and schools are basically informed about staffing, about what part's going to supplies and different things. But our charter schools have been able to manipulate their budgets to focus on the needs of the students in their building, what I would call decisions being made by the people that know the students by name. And they know what the particular needs are and where that's at. So one aspect of charters for our district is they're supposed to be idea generators, test beds, where we can try some things in a smaller setting and see what works. And they do that. We just don't ever copy their success and spread it out to the other buildings, unfortunately. I've suggested to someone at one of the alternative programs that's in its own building that he's in a unique position to take his school as from being an alternative to a charter. It's got the parent support, they've got their own building, they've got their program. I said, and if he can do it, then next we could try West or East High and see if they can do it. But I'm going to say that more than likely the superintendent does not approve of that strategy or idea. But the upshot is that our charters are open to everybody in the district. There are some thresholds where parents have to provide transportation. They're strongly encouraged to participate at the school. They don't have to, but a lot of parents see it as a barrier if they can't do that. So there are some equity issues. Charters tend to have students from more involved parents with more resources that are watching their kids. So they do tend to have better success. Those things all go together in a package, but they don't drain money from the neighborhood schools like charter programs in other states do. So it's we have the best relationship going between charters and public schools of anybody in the country.
I have to agree with what Andy said. I was on the Anchorage School Board when charter schools were instituted in the state of Alaska in the late 90s, and he's right. The charter community outside does not consider Alaska's charter schools to be comparable to what they've got. In fact, our charter schools are a lot like our optional programs, like Denali Montessori and Chugach Optional and Stellar Secondary, which were in existence for decades before the charter school movement came along. There are some things that we did wrong with charter schools, and one of them was charging charter schools rent for renting public facilities. That is ridiculous. I'm the one board member in Anchorage that voted against that right from the get-go. And now, a couple of decades later, they're having a lot of issues. The charter schools are cramped for funding because they have to spend base student allocation money on space. And that doesn't make any sense. Some of them have built their own buildings. I don't know how they can possibly afford to do that and still continue. Any other school in the public school system in Anchorage that needs capital money, we bond for that money and the taxpayers pay for it. And right now, charter schools aren't getting that benefit. I think there are some changes being made to how they're being charged if they are in Anchorage School District facilities, but it has gotten charter schools into a budget bind. And I know that Winterberry, for example, had a building built, but it doesn't have a common space like a cafeteria or a gym where all the kids can gather, and it's pretty tight on space. Of course, right now in COVID, that's not making much of a difference, as it's pretty much teachers only who are in the school buildings. But when things get more back to normal, we have to take a really good look at how charter schools are being funded in terms of their facility issues. And they do have a lot of independence from the school district on their curriculum. But again, there's also a lot of responsibility that comes with that. They don't operate independently in many aspects, and they do have to report to the Anchorage School Board as well as to the State Board of Education on a regular basis to continue their charters.
Thanks, Harriet. Derek, I'm sure you have some thoughts on this, but in the sake of getting on to some other subjects, since we only have about 15 minutes left or so total, I wanted to touch on something that touches what you've been involved with, Derek, and that is how we're adapting to COVID-19. So there's kind of a couple things I want to wrap into this. First, I know with Anchorage School District, they just announced a plan to return to in-person classrooms. Again, I don't want to make it just Anchorage specific, but looking broader, as an education system, this is something that all schools have to face. And I want to hear your thoughts on what we can do to make that safe, how that ties in with the online curriculum and what that exposes to what we can do to improve education generally. And then lastly, is COVID also another reason to talk about our classrooms having too many students in them? Another thing to think about. All right, so that's a lot to wrap in there, but Derek, if you could start with that, and then Andy and Harriet, if you have any kind of thoughts on adapting as a result of COVID and what we can learn from how we've had to adapt to COVID.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for that. I would start off by saying that Alaska teachers are pretty incredible, because within just a few weeks in March, they had their entire career turned on their head, shaken up, poured out, and it, to us, felt like we didn't even know how to teach again, because there was so much that happened, overnight. But Alaska teachers stepped up and showed that grit and resiliency that we tend to have from the rural parts of the state to here in Anchorage, all the way down to the far reaches of it. What I would say is we do have some really golden moments we can capitalize on as we move forward from this. But before I say that, you mentioned opening up, what that looks like, what that is. And truly, that's going to be a city by city issue. And the state just needs to be there to support each city and each region of Alaska that chooses to open up or not open up. But even in that, let me be a little clearer. We say open up, meaning opening up like the physical doors, when really school's in session right now. We're opened up, teaching via Zoom. But when you go to rural Alaska, there are places in Bush, Alaska, rural Alaska, out fly-in only, where COVID-19 is not a huge threat because of how serious that community has taken it and really restricted travel into those villages. In those areas, absolutely, I think teachers could likely meet in person, and students can meet in person, because your risk level is different than here in Anchorage or Fairbanks or Juneau, or where you have some of these population centers and population hotspots. So what does the state have to do with that? The state needs to just be talking to districts, and districts need to say, here's what we need to be able to do things safely and well. But where we need to really look at opportunities beyond COVID is how well our teachers have adapted to online education. And while myself and many of the other teachers were shaken up at first, now that we've got the hang of it, we're doing pretty good. Is it the same as in person? No. Nothing beats being able to, grab a pencil and mark something on a kid's paper, delete this word, it's too wordy in this sentence. Nothing beats that feeling of helping kids in that way. But the reality is, given the challenges that the state can face from time to time due to how vast it is, how big it is, when we empower our teachers to make curriculum, like I did and Barb did and many other teachers in Anchorage did, we pour into our teachers, showing them and saying them, we know you have the skills and ability to better our state. And the Anchorage School District did that. They hired teachers to build curriculums and build things to get people started, which is a lot better than, hiring another state to develop your curriculum and bringing in another state's curriculum, like what happened in the spring. And a lot of teachers statewide really felt disrespected like that. So I think moving forward, what we do is we go to teachers in every region of Alaska and we say, there are going to be challenges in the future. This is not going to be the last challenge we face as a state together. What can we do for your region to be equipped to do education? And that is a statewide discussion, because what I teach and how I teach can benefit greatly from learning how teachers in rural Alaska are teaching and what their challenges are. And if we utilize technology, we begin to take our really vast state and we begin to bring it a little closer, and we begin to know each other a little better. And then I get to know what's happening in Kotzebue and what are kids and teachers feeling there, and then how can I, support them. From a legislative perspective, it's, again, legislators like Representative Drummond that's here, or even we have Andy Holleman, who's a school board member, talking to different districts and just listening in and seeing how we can work together with it.
We have a lot of work to do in rural Alaska and even parts of urban Alaska in terms of internet connectivity. It is really miserable in some parts of the state. And as they've found where kids have to stay home, there are many villages where there isn't internet access available to individuals at home. And the districts are doing some really creative stuff with some kind of broadcasting Wi-Fi from their school building, which is likely the only broadband service in town. And the providers I know have stepped up around the state to provide internet access to families who can't afford it, and to upgrade access for families who already have accounts. But rural Alaska broadband access is sorely lacking in so many places. They have little better than dial-up. And it not only makes it difficult to teach kids, it makes it difficult to retain teachers in these remote communities, because they come there from other parts of the country and they have a difficult time keeping in touch with their family and friends back home because of the lack of robust internet access. So that we've got a lot of work to do in technology, as well as facilities. Teacher housing is badly needed in some of these communities. And it's not just for teachers. We have public safety officers around the state. We have a difficult time keeping them in remote villages because of the lack of decent housing. So there's just lots of issues, and they all bleed over from one segment to the next.
I'm going to jump on to another question now. And again, I don't want it to be Anchorage specific, but what can we do to improve the way students learn? So one of the things I hear a lot from educators is qualms with the notion of teaching to the test, that they're lacking certain skills. They're not getting certain critical skills like analytical, logical thinking skills when they're just practicing for a test. But on the flip side, we do have these proficiency standards in math and reading. So how do we, on the one hand, help them meet those proficiency standards, but also come up with other ways where they can learn more holistically? I know that's a very kind of a broad thing, but I think that'll be our last question that we have time to answer tonight.
Sure, I will talk a little bit about that. I'll make it very brief with it. I participate in a program within my school where we are actually kind of a smaller community. It's called SWS, or School Within a School. And basically the idea of the program is that we do more what's called social emotional learning. You'll hear that acronym in education. You might hear it as SEL, social emotional learning. And basically the idea is that if students are more comfortable with each other in the classroom, we're more comfortable with their teacher, and more comfortable with being a tighter knit community with each other, they're going to naturally help each other out in these skills, and they're going to be willing to take risks on those higher level thinking. So the goal is, if a student feels comfortable in a classroom setting, in a chair, sitting there or standing around or moving around the classroom, that out of that comfortability, that this is kind of a safe space or a second home or something like that, that they will take that risk to go to those challenges. And I can say personally, I've seen that play out time and time again. And if you think about it, it makes sense, right? we as adults often don't speak up too much or share too much or try and go to the next level until we feel comfortable in an area and in a space, especially if it's a new space or a new area. So only reasons to me that the more we make school, make our classrooms, that we incorporate those things of encouraging kids to take risks and they feel encouraged to go to those directions, that that's how we can avoid that teaching to the test. Rather, get to know your kids, get to build in these things, stop jam packing so much, because if you will front end build in the social emotional learning piece, back end, when you want to get deep into content, you can get into it so much quicker. You can get to it easier. And the students know Mr. Reed, Miss Clark has my best interest at heart. And once a student knows that, you can teach anything. I could teach a class how to take over the world even.
Anybody else want to add to that briefly?
I'll say real quick that for quite some time, we've had a huge emphasis on test scores. Standardized tests are useful, they matter, but we have put way too much emphasis on them. And what happened, especially in funding crunches, is districts started thinking, okay, if I can get my test scores up, then I can turn to the legislature and say, we've done our job, you need to shower us with money and reward us for having done a good job. And oddly, it hasn't worked out very well. I will say, I think in Anchorage for 5 or 6 years, we've had kind of an intense pursuit of test score improvement. That's led to standardization of the curriculum, that a publisher will say, if you teach this curriculum with fidelity, your students will get better test scores. And if you have better test scores, you'll be happier and people will like you more and everything wonderful will happen. But the downside is our classrooms really vary from one period to the next, from one building to the next. Some students are interested in some things, not in others. I do think this drive for standardization is harmful to a number of students. It bleeds out some of our most talented teachers that want to go somewhere where they can teach with a certain level of freedom. We do need to pay attention to the test scores, but we can't let them drive the conversation so much. In essence, what you're looking at is students that are kind of on the bubble. They're in the D range for grades. If you've got a student that's not quite proficient and you make him proficient, then you've done a wonderful job and things have gotten better. But if you take a kid that was maybe going to go to UAA, get them excited and they wind up going to University of Washington Med School, that doesn't matter. That doesn't change the number of proficient kids. That kid was already proficient. That kid was going to go to college, and that level of success is not looked at, it's not recorded, it doesn't have any impact on funding, and that's just wrong. We want to look at all the different areas. Those kids that are on the bubble about proficient and non-proficient, they matter. And we need to focus on them, but we also need to keep the focus on all those other areas where we historically have done a great job, but I kind of worry that our eyes are being pulled off that prize.
I hate to leave it on sort of a slightly downer note there, but I think it is a common unfortunate theme with education, and that is the notion that we're letting students slip through the cracks. And I think teaching to the test is one of the ways where that happens. But I think we could probably have continued for another hour easily. But I want to thank our panelists again, Derek Reed, who is a teacher with the Anchorage School District, Harriet Drummond, who is one of our House of Representatives members, and also long involved in education in her own prior public service background. And then Andy Holleman, who is a current member of the school board and also running for Alaska State Senate District M. Thank you all for joining. I just want to last note that I think that we have to find a way to invest in education in Alaska. if we all remember what happened after World War II, all of these servicemen came back from World War II and they found this thing called the GI Bill to help to pay for their education, help them go to college. What happened? The 1950s, an incredible, robust period of economic growth and prosperity in this country. And it's not an accident. So it's a direct connection between investing in education and investing in sustainable, growing, healthy economies. And with that, I will pass the proceedings back to Heather.
Thank you, Carl. And I did just get a quick message. Derek Reed had one last comment he wanted to make before we wrap things up.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, one of the best ways that you can support teachers right now in this election season is supporting candidates who support teachers, because what we have seen over the last 10, 20, 30 years, and what we've had a discussion tonight, is that who you elect matters when it comes to public education. So if you have the ability to, carlforalaska.com, and I believe it's carlforalaska.org. Sorry, carlforalaska.org, number 4.
.com.
Is it .com? Okay, well, I saw
right.
a head shake, so I thought I messed up. So carlforalaska.com, but number 4. If you can donate some money to Carl's campaign, because after many discussions with him, I know he's someone who's going to look out for the students of all of Alaska. And maybe you can't donate. We need volunteers to get out the vote, to tell people to vote for Carl. And if you don't know how important this is in terms of who Carl is facing down, Carl's Republican challenger that is facing him is so terrible on public education that NEA Alaska actually endorsed Kathy Giesel as a education champion during that Republican primary. And Kathy Giesel lost. So if that paints a picture for you of how bad the challenger is in this time where public education is under attack, that should let you know what it's like. So Carl, I'm so excited to be supporting you. And I ask everyone, please throw Carl, if he's just $10, throw him $10.
Thank you, Derek.
All right, I just had a couple of closing comments. One, I wanted to echo Carl's shout out. This was a great conversation. Thank you all so much for taking the time to be here and to participate.
Paid for by Carl Johnson for Alaska. P.O. Box 11022, Anchorage, Alaska 99511.